All right, that's going to do it for our Week 16 Sound Up Seattle Value Dogs. Next up, we've got probably what is going to be our favorite portion of the day because we don't have to talk about something bad or something disappointing. So it's time to talk Mariners. John, how do you want to open this segment? How do we want to start discussing the Mariners? Obviously, there's been a lot of rumors swirling about them and trades and what the front office wants to do. How do you want to start? What do you want to talk about first?
Okay, so this is what I want to do. I want to start talking about the pieces that left, just as kind of a refresher. There's some new names and stuff, but we mainly want to just, clear the decks for, okay, who is out from last year's team in, major roles. And then we should probably talk about the pieces on the board that we are, hearing about potentially moving. And then I think our longest conversation is, who is this team going to go and get,
Yeah.
So starting with who we lost, the three names that I have in terms of hitters are Jorge Polanco, Sam Haggerty, Josh Rojas. Bless their hearts, they're no longer with us. Now, two of those three do not make me sad at all. Jorge Polanco was immensely disappointing. He hit .213 all of last year. 16 home runs was actually pretty impressive on his part, but he just didn't give us the, at-bat to at-bat performance that we were expecting from a former All-Star. So, not quite good riddance, but also not quite fare thee well, Somewhere in between there. Sam Haggerty barely got on the field, only 15 at-bats, and he was .067 average in those 15, if they're even worth looking at.
Yeah, I think he tore his Achilles too, like midway through his stint in AAA as well. So just not a great season for Sam.
Sorry, Sam. We love you, but we'll see you later. And then Josh Rojas, beloved on this podcast, beloved by me specifically, started his season on an absolute tear. We thought he was the prince who was promised. We were ready to believe, but he ended up having his worst statistical season of his young career. He batted .269 in 2022 with 9 home runs, .245 in 2023 with 4 home runs, and then .225 in 2024 with 8 home runs. So, the power crept up a little bit, but his on-base plummeted about halfway through the year, and it never came back. So it's sad to see him go. I love him, but at the same time, his performance was not consistent.
Yeah, Rojas as a guy, he had a 91 OPS plus last year, which for those of you, again, newer to the Mariners discussion in the baseball stats, anything with a plus in it is relative to 100. So if you're below 100 with a plus statistic, that means you are below average. And Josh Rojas started the season with like an OPS plus of 140. Like he was hitting 345 at one point early on. So really, really fell off late in the season. It was tough. And we were really big fans of him on this pod. And just really couldn't pull through kind of in the last stint. Obviously a great defensive third baseman, but for whatever reason, he just couldn't develop any power. So tough to see him go. And we, like I said, we liked him, but I think it's time to move on, get a little bit better of a third baseman.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's certainly time. And we'll be excited to talk about third baseman here shortly.
Yes. With that, I will also mention one other guy, Austin Voth, the reliever, who, he was just kind of a big addition. Once we traded Ryan Stanek, he kind of took over that kind of third spot in the relief pitching, especially with the absence of Santos and Brash last season. It was like Austin Voth had to really step up. So he did a great job for the Mariners. Tough to see him go, but I'm sure he'll get a nice contract this next year, and he'll have made a lot of money from his performance last season. He was a very good reliever for us.
He's probably the most valuable guy that we lost in terms of game-to-game performance. He was a very known quantity, and it's a bummer to see him go, but does free up, a roster spot, frees up cap space, gives this team a little bit of flexibility.
Especially the way that we know this team works in the kind of bullpen reliever area, it's really easy for them to replace a guy like Austin Voth with internal guys. So and monetarily, it's not like it was any loss. We
have so much money and value tied up in those top 3 reliever names. Obviously, that didn't work out really in any way this last season with injuries, but you can't plan on those guys being non-factors. You have to plan on them being there and being effective with the way that we're paying them. So with that regard, he was very valuable last year, but if things go the way we hope, he wouldn't be as valuable next year.
To elaborate on that, you want to have contingencies. You don't want to hope and then not have a backup, but you do want to have players that can perform in those roles if you deal with those injuries. You don't want to just say, oh, Gregory Santos, who was injured 3 different times last year, is going to have a full healthy season. You can't assume that this starting rotation is going to be healthy like they have been the last 2 years. It's just like, these are things that you have to build in, but you don't want to allocate a ton of funds for because you have to make sure that you're spending your money right.
Correct. And especially on a team like the Mariners, who are not known for their big pockets, instead of worrying about contingencies, I would rather worry about the guys that actually play every single day. Our third baseman, our first baseman, these guys that are, we're seeing over and over and over again. How good are they? What are they compared to average? Especially with our starting pitching where it is and our salary cap where it is, let's not focus too much on contingencies. We got too many immediate problems.
Yes.
Don't worry about an extra life raft when, the current one is need patching.
The current boat is actually sinking as we speak. Yeah. So as we talk a little bit about pitching, let's jump into what is probably the biggest discussion for the Mariners this offseason, because they're not hugely in discussions with a ton of free agents, or at least super high value free agents like the Alex Bregmans of the world. We are expecting them to probably expecting is a strong word. We have heard a lot of things about them probably trading a starting pitcher, whether that be Brian Wu, Bryce Miller. I don't think they're going to trade George Kirby or Logan Gilbert, or the most commonly named one, Luis Castillo. John, just looking at those guys, thinking about that, who would you be most in favor of getting rid of? And when I say that, I don't mean it's, I don't mean you would like it, because people will get mad, but it is something that will potentially happen. We have to talk through it. So talk me through your thoughts about one of those guys getting traded.
So for me, it's a question of value. Having loved all these guys, I guess there's one guy I would pull out of that bunch. I'm not interested in moving Bryce Miller. When it comes to a conversation of value, he strikes me as a guy that has a lot of value now, but will have a lot more value in a year. It just seems like he is, in my mind, a lock as a really talented starting pitcher. And he hasn't, I don't think, fully reached that perception in greater baseball. It just seems like the wrong time to move him in my mind. So for me, this conversation is about Brian Wu and Luis Castillo. Now, the thing about those two is Brian Wu is young, and I think I forget sometimes how young he is. He's 24 years old. He was a member of the 2021 draft class. He was just impactful immediately, so we've really been paying attention to him from the very beginning. But he is very, very young, very, very talented. I'm sure we'll get into some of his stats. But so you have the young, really talented guy versus Castillo, 32 years old, much more of an old vet, but he is cheap. His contract is incredible right now. For a little context, Max Fried just signed an 8-year, $218 million contract with the New York Yankees. Castillo is owed less than a third of that amount per year over the next 3 years. So, he's not quite at Fried's level as a player, but, he's not miles off, and he's getting paid a third as much. So his contract is incredibly team-friendly. I think for the right price, I'd be willing to move on from either one of those guys. For me, it's a question of where do other teams see the value?
I 100% agree with you. I think when it comes to Brian Wu, it's do the Mariners think that his arm is too fragile for what they could be getting to trade him? If they think, okay, this guy is not going to be able to make 25 starts a year. I think he made 16, 20 last year. If he's not going to be able to make 25 starts a year, and you can trade him for a guy who is super controllable and who you portray as being able to make those starts, that's your third baseman right there. You could trade him immediately for, just to throw out a name who we will probably talk about at some point, you could trade him immediately for Alec Boehm from the Phillies, and probably someone else if they value him like I just mentioned. Because that's just so valuable to have so many years of control over a guy like Brian Wu, that kind of starting pitcher. Will the Mariners trade him? I don't believe so. I haven't heard any rumblings really about Brian Wu. As a guy, he is that fourth young starter that the Mariners could move on from in the terms of their areas of strength. But I still think that Brian Wu is a guy that the Mariners want to keep on this roster. I I still think in terms of odds, Luis Castillo is a guy the Mariners want to keep on this roster and has a 30% chance of getting traded at this point. Like all the talk, it's still not likely that Luis Castillo gets traded unless you can find a real suitor. Let's talk Luis Castillo. Like you said, super team-friendly contract. I think he's making just over $20 million a year for the next 3 years. And then, it's tough for Luis Castillo because he, as a guy, throws from a low arm angle. His body will not necessarily be able to produce as much power. He's a little bit smaller of a guy compared to a Logan Gilbert type pitcher. And so in 3 years, if he's unable to get an extension, that team, he's basically going to have to go into free agency and not have made and had the opportunity to sign a big contract like the Max Fried's, which was a great team-friendly deal for the Mariners. It just sucks for Luis Castillo in that situation.
Relatively.
$68.25
million over the next 3 years is pretty good.
It is pretty nice. I think you could live substantially off that. But yeah, at the end of the day, Luis Castillo is probably the most likely move, and you could trade him to a contender. Like a team like the Orioles, who just lost Corbin Burns, could really use a Luis Castillo in that rotation. They did just sign somebody, so that was just a team that popped into the top of my head. I'm not saying the Orioles are a major trade piece. There's also been talks with the Red Sox, I think, about getting Tristan Casas, who's a first baseman from the Red Sox, who I really didn't like name-wise, and then I looked into some of his stats, and I kind of got it. But yeah, a guy like that who's younger, more controllable, who has a cheaper contract, so you could work around with that. There's kind of ways to go about moving Castillo that would be beneficial. So if I were to pick, it would definitely be him.
Yeah, for me, that's where the value thing comes in. And it's an interesting comparison because Luis is older, but he's also more known. Wu has had injuries issues, which you implied, which kind of limits what his potential could be. Maybe we've seen the last of it, and he really, steps his way up into a, just outside the Cy Young discussion type of pitcher for the next, 6 or 7 years, or maybe his career kind of derails. It's hard to say. But objectively, Brian Wu's not only 8 years younger, but he had a better season than Castillo. Castillo had pitched 30 games to Wu's 22, but in those 30 games, he had a 3.64 ERA and a 1.17 WHIP. Wu in his 22 starts was a 2.89 ERA with a 0.9 WHIP.
Wu was electric. Wu was so good when he was healthy.
Yeah, Castillo, obviously known for his fastball, 93rd percentile on Savant in his fastball run value. Brian Wu is 95th percentile in his fastball run value, 93rd in pitching run overall to Castillo's 86. And then the big difference to me is Castillo, pretty good at preventing walks, 73rd percentile in walk rate. You know what Brian Wu is off the top of your head?
Probably above 9. I don't have anything pulled up on Savant, so you just tell me.
100. He has
really
the best walk rate in professional baseball. He is in 100th percentile in walk rate. So Wu, when he's on the mound, is objectively better. The question is, he's a 5-pitch guy to Luis's 4. They both throw the 4-seam slider, sinker, and changeup. But Wu throws the sweeper at 10%, so he's a true 5-pitch guy. I really like Wu. I like him a lot. But the question for me is, can he stay healthy? For the right trade, I would move on from Wu. And yeah, I would rather lose Castillo, especially if they're valued the same way. But if this team's talking about making a big swing, I do think Wu probably has more value to an opposing team.
Yeah, 100%. Let's talk potentially who they might add based on that or based on those trades. And let's get a little bit into what kind of the reverberations of if they make that trade, what happens with their offseason plan. Because really the area of strength that is, and gosh, it's really weird because I've heard so much on trading Luis Castillo for Tristan Casas from the Red Sox, trading for a first baseman, and to me that really doesn't make sense. And the real problem is there's just so many first basemen that are available. Like you can get Christian Walker for maybe 3 years, $60 million. That might be even a high valuation, but 3 years, $60 million. Like Christian Walker was a top 10 first baseman from on the Diamondbacks the last couple of years. Like he's been very good. Obviously Justin Turner's in the free agency market, and then Carlos Santana, like all guys that the Mariners have been known to be linked to, as well as you have Luke Raley, who is basically your fourth outfielder and backup first baseman, lefty platoon first baseman, if you want to do that. Like, the first base option is plentiful right now. And so if you were to trade Luis Castillo or Brian Wu for a first baseman, I would want it to be a major piece and or somebody that you could, that has a little bit more flexibility and could move to third or something like that. So what are your thoughts? Do you kind of feel the same way about that one?
I do. I've heard about the Cassis rumor as well. And I think the thing is, obviously, he's tied in. It would be him, and the ones that I've seen are him and a couple of like top 27 prospects, which, it's always good to reinvigorate the farm system, but I might want more immediate value. Cassis is a guy, he had a good 2023 season. He's young, he's only 24. And in 2023, he batted .263 and hit 24 home runs. Took a step back last year, 241, 13 home runs in about half the at-bats. I think he must have gotten hurt. I don't follow the Red Sox, but I'm assuming it was injury that cost him and that he just wasn't able to get up and running in the same way as he did the previous year. But, these are real names. This is, Castillo's a guy that competed for Cy Young a couple years ago. I don't think Cassis and a couple of prospects are on the level of his value.
You think about the value that kind of trade would give the Mariners, and a lot of it would be monetary value. You're offloading $22 million of salary for what would be closer to, I think, $8 million.
Sure.
So that frees up $14 million, for a team that's as strapped for cash as I'm gonna say that in quotes, strapped for cash, because they're really not. The owners could spend more, but with what they can work with, $14 million would be a lot for this team. The main thing is, like, what do you do? Who do you go sign if you make that trade at third base? Or are you just going to say, okay, Ryan Bliss, Cole Young will play second base and Dylan Moore's third base? Because we saw last year, Dylan Moore is so flawed when he plays every day. He won the utility player gold glove, and we talked so much trash about him towards the end of the season because it's just what Dylan Moore does. He gets overexposed.
Yeah, he has a role. I just want to shout out a name I think is far less realistic, but a name that's out there as a trade chip right now. And it does not necessarily fit into the team at all. I like to do this. I like to take big swings at players that don't make a lot of sense. But it's nice to say their names on a podcast. I'm looking at Brent Rooker on Oakland. Guy plays left field. It's why you love the outfield, man. You can shuffle him around. It doesn't matter. He was unbelievable last year. 293 average, 562 slugging, hit 39 home runs. His last two seasons, he's hit 69 home runs combined. He's a guy that's kind of come on late in his career. He's already 30 years old, so that would, cut into his value a little bit. But I'm not even going to read you any of his savant numbers. Let me just tell you that there's a lot of red when you're looking at his batting. He strikes me as the kind of guy, he's 30 years old, he's on the Oakland Raiders, I guess Las Vegas Athletics. I shouldn't even say Oakland anymore.
Sacramento, I think, next year.
Okay, Sacramento Athletics. He's a guy that's closer to a 1-for-1 to me for either of these guys, as opposed to a Tristan Cass, an Addison Barger is another name at third base. Some of these guys where it's like, okay, you get him, and then how many prospects come along with? Brent Rooker's the type of guy where it's like, okay, we went Castillo for Rooker straight up. I wouldn't be weeping tears.
Yeah, I don't want to turn into the A's where it's like we trade, they traded Matt Chapman, they traded Matt Olson, like they traded a bunch of great guys back in whatever it was. I think they had a really good team in 2018, 2019 era. And they traded a bunch of really good guys for just like a bulk package, and that didn't really give them anything. Like, you need to get a good solid return in these trades if you're going to get rid of a guy like Luis Castillo or Brian Wu. Yeah. So I agree with you. I like Brent Rooker a lot. It's tough to imagine that we as the Mariners would want to trade Brian Wu to a team that we're going to play 19 times a year or whatever it is.
But Castillo makes more sense in that sense. He's
Castillo does, especially if he's going to, if he's going to be making $22 million a year, he's going to be there. He would be their number one pitcher. He'd be their guy that they put everywhere, which would be cool for Castillo. But yeah, I think I really like Brent Rooker. I don't know how well he fits. Like, that trade fits what the Oakland A's want. Like, they, as the A's, want more bulk packages.
Sure.
So they would probably want more prospects for a guy like Brent Rooker. But I like where your head's at, and especially Rooker is more of a DH. He doesn't really play defense very well, so it would be nice to just slot him into that DH spot and play him every day from there.
That's a good note. That's a good note. Yeah, and the Castillo thing, yeah, if they wanted Castillo, it would certainly be more as like a rental to then turn him around later, but then why trade for him in the first place is the question.
Yep. Next up, let's talk a little bit of third base. We're getting to the 1 hour mark, and we'll have to stop because we got to record another one. But do you see? I mentioned Alec Boehm earlier in the pod, and he's a top 10 third baseman in the league. Third base is kind of a spot where it's like it's a little underwhelming. Like there's kind of 15 third basemen in the league that are good, and then maybe 5 that are great, but none of those 5 are ever going to leave their teams right now. Or are not in a position. And then you have guys like Alex Bregman, who, as much as people like Alex Bregman as a player, I don't think he would play well in T-Mobile. He plays so well with the short porch in left field for the Astros. And the Mariners, Mariners Stadium is not that kind of bandbox. So I don't think Bregman plays well in terms of a free agent signing.
Plus, I don't want Bregman.
Yeah.
I don't want any Astros on this team.
That's fair. Who do you see? I mean, there's got here. I'll pull out 2 names. I'll pull out the 2 names that I think are the big pieces that could be a little bit more known guys that the Mariners could go for. Nolan Arenado, St. Louis Cardinals, 33-year-old guy who didn't necessarily play super well last year, but a 101 OPS plus with 23 doubles and 16 home runs, ended at 272 with a 325 on base and a 394 slugging. Still a Gold Glove finalist. He's still good defensively, but he is definitely slipping. And then you've got a guy like Alec Boehm from the Phillies who had a 117 OPS plus, hit 280 with a 332 on base, 448 slugging, 15 home runs, 5 stolen bases, a really good first half, and then kind of fell off in the second half of the season. Of those 2, who kind of sticks out to you more? And if there's another name that you're thinking of, let me know.
Yeah, Arenado would be awesome, obviously. He just declined a Astros trade today, which brought me a lot of joy. He closed the door on that one using his no-trade clause. Obviously, his no-trade clause means that would be a harder one to achieve. But there's little doubt in my mind that he would be the better fit on this team. I think him and Julio would do really well together. And then, obviously, completely spacing right now, our Rays acquisition, whom I love dearly.
Randy Rosarena.
Randy Rosarena would be awesome. But yeah, I think those are 2 great names. Obviously I just threw out a big name, but I always, when we're trying to get down into the nitty gritty, I try to avoid, some of those biggest names, some ones that stand out to me, that are also, just in some different situations. Ryan McMahon on Colorado.
Have you ever heard the name McMahon?
That's not how you pronounce that.
That's how you pronounce that. You've never had a friend with the last name McMahon?
It's not. It's spelled Mahon. That's McMahon?
Yeah.
Ryan McMahon. That makes more sense, honestly. Has been very consistent in his career. He's 30 years old. In his 3 seasons in the MLB, he's averaged 246, 240, 242, and he's hit 20, 23, and 20 home runs over the last 3 years. So that's a guy that is a known quantity. Used to playing in the cold. Obviously not necessarily used to the heavy air down here, but not like a guy coming up from Arizona that's going to be shocked by the cold weather. I just think he strikes me as a name that's maybe a little more realistic. Colorado's in a place where, they should be open to all sorts of trades. And then maybe a lower end. If that's a medium-sized trade, a lower end would be like an Addison Barger out of Toronto. 25 years old, really young, only hit 200 last year with 7 home runs in 208 plate appearances, so didn't get a ton of run, but 99th percentile in arm strength. He's a hell of a fielder. And it'd be interesting to see if he can grow into a bigger role on this team. Yeah. Obviously, though, Arenado would be the best.
I think in terms of guys that are available and on the trade blocks, it's Arenado, it's Boehm. Honestly, if McMahon was available, I would be happy to trade for McMahon. We'd probably be trading prospects for a lot of these guys because, especially like a team like the Cardinals is trying to rebuild. A team like the Phillies wants to compete now, so we could probably. There's a world where we could get a Castillo trade done for Alec Boehm. We would probably have to give them some money or figure something out to make that work because Alec Boehm is 2 years for a pretty controllable guy. We might actually be able to swing that as just a 1-for-1. But either way, like those 3 are really good names. And then I like the step down kind of discussion of, okay, maybe we could talk, Luis Rengifo from the Los Angeles Angels, like guys like that are also options, especially for this team, because they just need a string. They need to put somebody in that 7 hole. Like I would be happy with Luis Rengifo hitting 7th for the Mariners right now. So there's some options there at the third base spot, but it would be through trade. And I think that's the big thing that people are missing. It's like, we don't want to trade a pitcher for one of the positions that is so available in free agency, like a first baseman.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Mariners want to stick with, the Bliss, Dylan Moore, potentially Cole Young platoon type situation at second base for this season, and kind of just have that be their 9 spot. So in terms of the acquisitions that need to be made, it's first base, it's third base. Those are the options. Those are who we've heard about. Anything else to say before we can kind of put the lock on this Mariners discussion and throw it out there?
No, I think you did a great job summarizing there. Yeah, those are the 2 positions of need, and yeah, we're in a good position to address both. We've got a glut at pitching. We've talked about this before. This is a good time, especially after last year, to prioritize hitting, prioritize improving this offense. Moving on from a guy like Luis would be great. That's a great point about moving him to the Phillies. Maybe the only situation where we can move him for value to a team that would want him.
Yeah.
And then, try to address first base and free agency, and that'll be exciting. I'm sure we'll have more to say on that as time goes by. But this was more of a third base and pitching discussion. And, it would be obviously very sad to lose Luis or Brian or whoever. But I'm not sure how you feel, but I really think it's time.
Yeah, no, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling spicy about this Mariners offseason. This next little bit's going to be good. For those of you that, are watching us on YouTube, we do this kind of talk all the time. Basically every week we'll talk something new in Seattle sports, something that's going on. And if there is a Mariners trade that goes through, unless it's like Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, we will be making an emergency pod, whether that's just me hopping on to talk through it or us both talking at some point about the trade or about the signing, whatever it is. We will have a discussion on that. So feel free to follow, subscribe, do all that stuff. Anything else to say before I sign us off?
Get us out of here.
All right. Yeah, we've got to record another one right now. So for John Carey, I'm Tyler Cartwright. This has been the Sound Up Seattle podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of Sound Up Seattle, please feel free to give us a follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. You can subscribe to our YouTube at Sound Up Seattle. You can email us your questions, comments, concerns at soundupseattle@gmail.com. You can find us on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram at Sound Up Seattle. You can find me, Tyler, at TyCart50 everywhere it's important. And you can find John
playing Skyrim again because I'm a maniac.
He's back on the Skyrim grind. For those of you that have been following along the entire time, he does this twice a year now.
Twice a year. I never get very far. I always just start, play through level 25 and then quit, and then I'll just start a new game. I never pick up where I left off.
Well, level 25 is 50 hours of gameplay or something like that?
It doesn't take me very long.
All right. Well, and I guess with all that being said, let's go Seahawks. That's kind of the only real team that's playing we talked about.
Yeah, that's very right. Go Mariners, make a good trade. Go M's.